By 1819, Britain had a huge unemployment and poverty problem. And recruited sponsors to help their countrymen leave Britain. Faced with hunger, class division, lack of government representation, unemployment, long hours, and low wages, these people had no choice but to go to the colony. Many in Britain protested the settlement scheme as a plan to ship off and abandon Britain's poor and unemployed into foreign lands. The burden of the enormous debt after the wars and the failure of the American cotton crop brought the distress of the British poor to an unbearable point. 16 August 1819 saw the biggest working class protest in British history. Their banners read, "Let us die here like men and not be sold like slaves." In this protest, militia killed a number of unarmed protesters. The massacre is called the Peterloo Massacre, where dozens were killed and close to 700 injured. The announcement in 1819 of an ambitious government-sponsored settlement scheme to the Cape Colony was announced. The announcement in the Times of London stated the colony had the finest soil and the climate in the world and all the luxuries in life. They started arriving in 1820 and were given huge farms, thousands of acres, in an already disputed area in the Eastern Cape. The areas were already in an advanced stage of ethnic cleansing. These settlers traveled to South Africa with grand dreams of a natural paradise where they could be landmasters, were from British industrial towns made up of rural tradesmen, including mechanics and artisans. And all their dreams came true. The British found the Heeren 17 settler particularly lazy and scandalous because of their dependence on enslaved people and wanted them replaced with hard-working English stock. These first British settlers, excited to be elevated from parish indigents to gentry, departed in August 1819. Another group of 1,000 left in December, having been promised 1,000-acre plots rent-free for 10 years. 119 immigrants and their families moved from Lancaster to establish a border industry in South Africa. They were relocated with a cotton factory being established. This project failed after these British settlers realized that they were cannon fodder for the British on the frontiers. Of these settlers, 36% were men, 20% women, and 44% children. Within just a few years, many of them had abandoned this freely gifted land and returned to being artisans and merchants. By that time, the Heeren 17 had lost its foothold entirely in the Cape, and the community of 26,000 whites were completely lost. The colonial administration complained bitterly about the state of health of the settlers arriving at the Cape. Immigration on board also complained that when men arrived, they refused to be called by the title they had upon boarding ships in Britain. They also refused to do the work they were allocated and rendered themselves eligible for higher posts. On July 30th, 1859, the Cape Town Immigration Board forwarded a letter to the Crown in London informing them of the death of one of their settlers. And this is what they wrote. They wrote that it would be recommended a more strict inquiry into the health of immigrants generally, and that none be sent out, but such are and have been for some time in perfect health and in a habit of working for wages. Child trafficking and child slavery was rife. England started sending orphaned and vulnerable children to battlefields in 1619 when they sent 100 children as reinforcement to Jamestown, Virginia, and another 100 was sent in 1622. Until it was stopped in 1757, the act of spiriting, meaning kidnapping of children and transporting them from Scotland to work in America, was ended. From 1830, the Children's Friendship Society, although there were already thousands of unaccompanied children in the New World, started keeping records of the children they sent to the Cape, America, and Australia. The Act of Proscription of 1747 of England banned Scottish culture, including the wearing of kilts. Their language were banned, the gathering of clans, and the confiscation of all ancestral land, including banning of bagpipes. The Scottish Highlands clearance saw large-scale evictions and forced removals from 1750 to 1890. The Great Famine, the collapse of industries, the scarcity of land and jobs were some of the key factors forcing the Scottish in their thousands to leave between 1830 and 1939. The first group of Scottish immigrants arrived in the Cape on the 14th of June, 1817, another group of 50 in August of the same year, and a larger group in September of the same year. Irish immigrants started in earnest arriving in 1820. These illiterate, unemployed peasants arrived in the Cape and were also given free land and farms, which they gave names such as Kildare, Dromore, and Dargle. The Cape Colony attracted approximately 5,000 people fleeing the potato famine. The passage was costly at 4 times more than crossing the Atlantic to Canada, America, and Peru. The Cape Colony was deeply unattractive due to the required conversion from Catholic to Calvinism. The outbreak of the Seventh Isixhosa War was widely publicized, with negative references to the savage and the backwards native. The protests against immigration to the Cape was extreme, and it went further by exhibiting a Khoi family of 5 living in shacks to discourage immigration. In 1844, the Cork Examiner called for the Irish to consider the Cape Colony as it would benefit both countries. South African settlers, however, were not so excited to receive what they considered pitiful people from pitiful living conditions and general poverty. There were continued concerns about Irish immigrants arriving in the colony. They were incentivized by free passage. The first group of 500 Irish arrived from Wicklow, Longford, and Cork. The first group of 60 single women would be given 10 shillings on arrival and guaranteed employment and accommodation. The second group arrived, almost all were ill, which contributed to the anti-Irish sentiment. They preferred to be settled in a more English location than the Cape. Many of them settled in Albany in the Eastern Cape. With the Cape Khoi and the San almost completely exterminated and invisible by now, the anti-convict, anti-Irish movement divided the settlers and gave way for questions of sovereignty on land stolen from indigenous people going forward. In 1841, Earl Grey proposed that all prisoners finishing their sentences in the Cape Colony, be freed and given free land, and be given apprentices of enslaved people. The policy was to populate the Cape with foreigners, and it was further frustrated by the anti-convict crisis. Although the Cape started receiving prisoners from Britain more than 100 years earlier, in May 1849, the Anti-Convict Association was ready for a blockade to ensure that the Cape does not become a full-on penal colony. This movement received massive support from the Jewish community, actually, although much of the protests were about the proposed penal colony. It was also about the famine Irish arriving with famine fever and a hysteria caused in Quebec, Canada, and in Montreal. There was widespread fear of famine diseases. Between 1904 and 1905, there were 5,000 Irish settlers in indigenous areas. These areas were renamed Cradock, Belfast, Uppington, Caledon, and Salowris Pass. Their arrival pushed indigenous Khoi and San into municipal townships and into indenturement and enslavement. During 1900 and 1920, the settler population doubled. It was agreed that in order to maintain the proportions between Africans and Europeans, it needed to increase immigration. At that time, many settlers were returning to Europe after making more than their imagined fortunes. In 1920, the settler government decided that people of Western European stock who shared genetic similarities were better suited for this stolen country. Shortly thereafter, the previously arrived settlers pressurized